Hello and welcome to the 83rd edition of the GreenWave podcast by SYNI International. I'm SYNI, your hostess, and today's pod is titled Carbon Neutral, Carbon Zero and the Holiday Dinner Debate. Late August is peak season for airport queues and family judgements, and this podcast episode begins with both. In the dog days of summer, we're bringing you, our listeners, a real-world example where climate language has escaped the carbon accounting manuals and landed at the dinner table. Yet the basic terms of carbon accounting still get mixed together, all day, every day. That confusion creates poor personal choices, shaky corporate claims, and some surprisingly confident arguments over dessert. Picture this. A dinner table set this summer on a lovely evening, with all members of the modern family joining in conversation. One daughter is discussing her upcoming holiday trip with her new boyfriend, very excited to share the details. To her surprise, she's being given a quick climate lecture by one of her brothers, which turns into an energetic carbon audit by all of her siblings. Too many international holidays, they said, too many flights, too large a footprint for someone who claims to care about climate change. Her defense came quickly. She pays to offset the carbon from every flight, or travels by train when in country, and she tries to stay in hotels carrying credible sustainability certification. So, she argued, her travel is carbon neutral. And suddenly dinner had moved from holiday gossip into carbon accounting and climate accountability. This dinner debate exposed something we think is genuinely useful for a late summer GreenWave episode. Carbon neutral and carbon zero are often treated as interchangeable phrases. They describe very different outcomes, and once you understand the difference, our frequent traveller had a much stronger case than the rest of the table initially gave her credit for. Carbon neutral starts with a defined footprint. You calculate the greenhouse gases associated with an activity, reduce what you reasonably can, then compensate for the remaining emissions through credible carbon credits or removals. The important word there is balance. The emissions can still physically occur. The neutrality claim comes from balancing those measured emissions across the boundary you have defined. Carbon zero sets a harder test. For this episode, we're using carbon zero in its plainest sense. The activity reaches zero carbon emissions within the boundary being claimed. The activity itself gets to zero. That is easier for some parts of life than others. A building can move towards zero operational carbon by replacing fossil fuel heating and running on clean electricity. A long-haul aircraft in normal commercial service still burns aviation fuel, so the passenger's journey carries physical emissions. Then there is net zero, which sits in the same family of language and causes another round of confusion. Net zero requires very deep emissions cuts first, leaving only a small residual that is then neutralised through durable carbon removals. For companies, that distinction is substantial. Buying credits against a large continuing footprint can support a carbon-neutral claim under the right methodology. A serious net zero pathway requires the underlying emissions from operations and value chains to be stripped back first. The residual becomes the small tail, not the business model. So, back to our summer dinner table. The travelling daughter takes a return economy flight from Lisbon to New York. The direct route is roughly 5,400 kilometres each way. Using a current 2026 long-haul economy emissions benchmark that includes the wider climate effects of aviation, a return trip comes out at around 1.3 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per passenger. That's one holiday flight, about 1.3 tonnes per holidaymaker. The aircraft still burns jet fuel, and the emissions still enter the atmosphere. If she measures that footprint properly and retires 1.3 tonnes of high-quality carbon credits against it, she has a reasonable basis for describing that flight as carbon neutral. Her siblings were demanding something closer to carbon zero. Commercial aviation cannot currently deliver that outcome on a Lisbon to New York flight. For us at SYNI International, this distinction changes the quality of the dinner debate. Offsetting is frequently dismissed as buying forgiveness for pollution. That criticism lands when the credit is poor, the accounting is sloppy, or the buyer uses offsets to avoid obvious reductions. A credible carbon credit needs to survive tougher questions. Would the emissions reduction have happened without the carbon finance? Will the reduction last? Has somebody else already claimed the same ton? That gives us additionality, permanence, and no double counting. Carbon markets have spent years tightening those rules because a ton printed in a registry should correspond to a genuine climate outcome. Cheap paperwork does very little for the atmosphere. Credits also differ in what they finance. 1 ton may come from methane capture, forest protection, or engineered carbon removal. The climate accounting can still use tons, but the durability and risk profile can be very different. That's why the airline checkout box deserves a little more attention than most of us give it. The useful questions are basic. What project generated the credit? Who verified it? And has the credit been retired? A payment button with a picture of a tree is not due diligence. And the traveller has responsibilities too. Flying economy, rather than business, reduces the allocated footprint per passenger. Great for the company CEO to show climate solidarity and head back into the economy seats while saving his company money. Direct routes usually avoid the extra emissions created by additional takeoffs and landings. Fewer trips reduce the footprint before any credit is purchased. Those choices strengthen the carbon neutral claim because reduction should come before compensation. Current carbon neutrality standards follow that hierarchy for good reason. Now, consider the hotel. A sustainability badge on a booking page can range from serious third-party certification to a green leaf designed by somebody in marketing on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Travellers need to know what sits behind the badge. The EU eco-label, for example, requires certified accommodation to meet mandatory environmental criteria. Energy consumption, water use, and waste management are part of the assessment. Green Key also uses defined criteria and regular recertification. And the Global Sustainable Tourism Council provides standards plus an accreditation system that helps travellers distinguish serious certification from a hotel grading its own homework. These systems can show that a property is managing its footprint more seriously, measuring performance and cutting avoidable resource use. Carbon Zero demands a separate and much tougher emissions claim. That still has value. A hotel investing in efficient cooling, renewable electricity, or lower impact operations is reducing the emissions that eventually need to be balanced. Reduction makes neutrality more credible and brings the business closer to zero. There is also a commercial lesson here. Airlines, hotels, and travel platforms know that customers increasingly look for environmental claims when choosing where to spend. Every carbon-neutral ticket or green hotel badge therefore carries reputational value. It also carries reputational risk. If an airline sells an offset option, customers should be able to see how the flight emissions were calculated and what kind of credits were retired. If a hotel claims certification, the certifier and status should be easy to find. And Europe is about to put more teeth behind that. From September 27th, new EU consumer rules apply that restrict vague environmental claims and unreliable sustainability labels. That's the end of next month. Rather good timing for our family dinner debate. Which takes us back to our traveller. Carbon accounting gives us a method for measuring impact and taking responsibility for it. A high-quality offset can finance a verified reduction or removal elsewhere and balance the measured footprint under a carbon-neutral framework. The combustion inside the aircraft engine remains a physical emission. And in our dinner table case, the daughter definitely wins the central argument. She understood that carbon neutrality allows a measured footprint to be balanced. She was also making choices to reduce the impact of accommodation and taking responsibility for flight emissions that most passengers simply leave behind them. There is one boundary condition. If she describes her travel as carbon neutral, the accounting can be reasonably clear. If she describes her entire life as carbon neutral, the calculation needs to widen to home energy, food, purchases, and the rest of her transport. That is harder, but the principle survives. Define the boundary. Measure it properly. Reduce what you can. Compensate for the residual with credits that can withstand scrutiny. Carbon neutral is a useful rung on the ladder. Carbon zero is the much harder destination. We need both ideas understood properly because the transition will be built through stages. A household, traveller, or company can take responsibility for emissions today while working towards deeper reductions tomorrow. Perfect behaviour is a fairly useless entry requirement for climate action. Better accounting and better choices can start now. And perhaps that is the useful lesson from a summer family dinner. Before accusing your sister of personally melting Greenland because her boyfriend booked a surprise long weekend abroad, make sure everybody at the table is arguing about the same carbon concept. The atmosphere will take the tons either way. The family group chat may be less forgiving. Well, that's a wrap on our 83rd GreenWave podcast episode. Thank you for spending the dog days of summer with us. You can find the GreenWave podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean. We're also on Spotify, iHeart, and Podchaser, and on Boomplay and Player FM. Please follow the pod, share the episode, and leave us a review wherever you listen. Follow Synergy International on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. And visit us at synergy-international.net. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.